You've got my good side? Good.
You ready to go?
Okay. Welcome and thanks everybody for coming. I'm Mark Laframboise, one of the managers here at Politics and Prose. Dr. Avner Cohen, the author of Israel and the Bomb, is Senior Research Fellow at the National Security Archive. Formerly, Dr. Cohen was co-director of the Project on Nuclear Arms Control in the Middle East at the Securities Program at MIT. In 1997 to 98, he was a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, where he was working on issues related to arms control and the peace process in the Middle East. After undergraduate study at Tel Aviv University in philosophy in 1975, Dr. Cohen earned his MA in philosophy at York University and PhD from the Committee on History of Culture of the University of Chicago. He was a member of the philosophy department at Tel Aviv University from 1983 to 1991 and has been visiting professor at various American universities and colleges. Avner Cohen has written a definitive book on Israel's development of the bomb. Using archival materials made recently available, Mr. Cohen has been able to explain the decisions that led to its development, decisions made by both the Israelis and the Americans. In preparing this introduction, Carla Cohen, who wishes she could be here right now but was suddenly called away, called this book, quote, unusually clear-eyed, particularly in its discussion of the impact of nuclear development on Israel. And we are very happy to have Avner Cohen speaking this afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. The best independent bookstore in Washington, D.C. that happen to be a client, as well as, in this case, an author. So I feel very much privileged to be here and to talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to say a few things, actually, about the history of the book. I thought that it took me 8 years to write it, long time. And I had all kind of difficulties. Part of it was access to material. Part of it was even emotional difficulties. Part of it was even police investigation that was initiated about allegedly or possibility of censorship violation in Israel. So the story of writing this book was a complex one. I would like actually for the first time to say a few things in public about what was for me writing that book. I'm a professional philosopher, and I recall that many years ago, almost 20 years ago, my very good colleague Stephen Lee from Harvard College called me and said, Avner, I was my first year of teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. What about us writing something about, this was the early 80s, and we were all, in a way, children of the anti-nuclear consciousness of the early 80s. And Steve called me and said, Avner, what about doing some kind of philosophical anthology about nuclear weapons, morality? And I was at that time almost having a contract with the University of Minnesota Press to have my dissertation into a book. And I felt, yes, that's something I would like to do because the issue is very, very important and because I always, in a sense, thought about this issue from a child. The notion of humanity have the power to destroy itself. The very notion that you have a little grapefruit size of plutonium that if it be imploded in a certain way could destroy a whole city was always for me a major wonder. And if philosophy starts with wonder, as Aristotle one time told us, I thought there is something very profound, there is something very philosophical, there is something very incomprehensible and strange about this. So we did that book, that anthology called Nuclear Weapons and the Future of Humanity, with all kinds of more important, less important people. It came out in 1986, a little bit after the main attention to the anti-nuclear consciousness of the early 80s. And then I came back to Israel, and I began to look at the situation in my own home country. I thought there is something very strange. I knew it before. This was even before Vanunu, the Israeli technician who told the story to the Sunday Times, but it was obviously more in there after Vanunu. This is the biggest Israeli story, in a way. This is the biggest Israeli taboo. And I felt the time has come to try to say something about this strangeness, about this unique Israeli attitude full of ambivalence about nuclear weapons. On the one hand, you need that kind of weapons, or at least Ben-Gurion, the founder of the program, felt that way from the early 50s, in order to ensure that Holocaust will never happen again. But at the same time, you're very much concerned not to trigger the other side, the Arabs, into having their own nuclear weapons, because then you can bring about, because of your own deeds, exactly what you would like to prevent: Holocaust. And of course, in the Israeli case, one, God forbid, bomb over Tel Aviv would be the end of Israel as we know it. So this ambivalence, profound ambivalence, I think is at the core of that taboo. Issue that even to this very day cannot be spoken. And I felt this was still at the late 80s. Time has come to try at least to say something anthropologically, politically, culturally about it. I applied to the MacArthur Foundation, and they were very nice to give me a grant. Research and writing this was again in the context of international security and nuclear weapons. And I came to MIT. I have a good friend there, Marvin Miller, and we began to work on a book that will have some historical component and some component that had to do with arms control and so forth. It was the Gulf War, and the more I put myself into that history, I realized that I'm about to recover an incredible Israeli story. And I was very much into this mood of following and tracing. And I recall that very vividly one time that we drove back, myself and my assistant, from the Sde Boker, which is the home of the Ben-Gurion Research Center, and we found some very interesting documents. And it so happened that the woman who ran that archive, her husband is working in Dimona. And I began to talk to her about that. And I just recognized very vividly how she was, the moment she understood that my purpose, she felt so uncomfortable, not so much about me, but about the topic and about referring the fact that somebody in her family was a senior scientist. It was so obvious to the two of them, the two of us, my assistant and myself, about what was going on. So what I would like to say is to give you a few images of some of those pictures, some of those moments during these 8 years of writing the book. And at the same time, moments that I felt difficulties. There was queries by the Israeli security establishment about it, that later on became a petition to Supreme Court. And that to access, on the one hand, a sense of recovering something very profound, something that has a lot to say, not just about hidden history, but also about the very identity of Israel today, and about the changes in Israeli images from tiny country of less than 2 million that had a chutzpah to launch such a major project to a country that is the biggest and the strongest in the Middle East, and reaching now peace agreement with a very strong sense of strength and might. And there is no question that even though the bomb has been to this very day, notwithstanding my own book, at the shadow of all these political processes, it had something to do with the Arab recognition that time has come to talk to the Israelis, to acknowledge their existence, to make peace with them. So it was a shadowy it was a shadowy entity, and it has a shadowy presence. And the recovery of that shadowy presence was, for me, a very intriguing project. So I'll give you a few moments from that. We put FOIA requests in this country, which is Freedom of Information Act request. Some of them, we, a colleague of mine and myself, put in the early 1990s, 92. And only about 95, 96, we began to find them. And we found some very intriguing documents. Documents that gave us for the first time what we already knew in some vague sense about a confrontation between Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, about the bomb. And it's one letter. In that exchange, Kennedy tells Ben-Gurion that if we are not going to get some understanding on this critical issue, and now I'm almost citing from Kennedy's letter, and it was classified until the mid-90s, the very security and well-being of Israel would be seriously jeopardized. What Kennedy wanted at the time was to have American inspectors visiting Dimona to verify what Israel promised him, namely that the whole thing is essentially for peace. They say it's for peace, but at the same time, in another meeting between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion 2 years earlier, which I always was able to recover in the documents, it was said, and Ben-Gurion said, he took a little cavity, saying, if something unusual will happen in the Middle East, maybe we will have to change that. It is for peace, but we need to be sure. And if something unusual will happen in terms of politics, things could be different. In other words, he kept himself a little margin of safety. Of course, the interest of Kennedy at the time and the interest of Ben-Gurion at the time was to try to reach some kind of understanding, not to make the issue public. And indeed, the history of the American-Israeli relations going through that way. But the discovery of those letters, which I bring many of them in almost complete citations, was quite a tremendous moment. Some other moments were on the Israeli side. I was able to make many people to talk to me. And indeed, we had certain ground rules that people look at what I took from them. There was a lot of information that was given to me that does not appear in the book, that was off the record. It was agreed to be off the record. But one of the stories by a man who was, and it was a pleasure to meet many of these people. Some of them are even in their 80s, almost all of them 70s and up. And many of them have good memory and have good sense of the dramatic activities and the sense of drama of those activities that were involved. And I recall one of them, a senior scientist who were working for part of the Israeli defense establishment, and his job was directly to supervise the weaponization project. By the way, he never told me that explicitly. It was obvious, and it was part of the understanding between him and myself that I know what he did, but he never certain words said, like never fully acknowledging the presence of the bomb, the existence of the bomb. But we created a certain kind of relationship and understanding that it emerged, and it was obvious. And I thought it was very interesting. He told me that at one time in the 60s, when he was communicating with the political level, and the political level was the Deputy Minister of Defense at the time, Shimon Peres, which was the executive director of the entire project, all the elements. That's his credit, that was his baby. And at the end of the talk, I'll say something about Shimon Peres. He wrote me a very nice letter about this book. And that person said that at one point, the people who ran, the administrator and the scientists who ran the program, needed to get from the political level some clarification as to the final product. It could be a bomb, it could be a device, it could be everything short of something. And they asked the political level in writing. This was an important letter that was sent to the political level. And there were 3 options that were mentioned in terms of the final product that that stage of the R&D was supposed to produce. Interestingly enough, the political level, Shimon Peres, never wrote back. And this was not the first time. In other words, there was an element of ambiguity and opacity in the relationship, even within the classified world that dealt with these issues. Certain things were never put in a very explicit way. And I think this is a very profound way. In other words, it is not just simply secrecy for the others, for the Americans, for the Arabs, for the Russians, but even certain words at certain time were not used, were taboo to the people in the inside of the project. I recall, and you know, it's when you do that kind of research for a long time and you spend enormous amount of time talking about many long weeks in very different archives in Israel and the US, you get all kind of material. Sometimes you get stuff by mistake. And I recall at Israel State Archive that the director, Dr. Freundlich, happened to be over time a friend of mine, and I just tried to push the limit to get more and more material to be declassified for me. And I talked to the people, former ambassador, who do this work of declassification. And at one point I got a document that it was obvious to me, either it was a mistake or somebody oversight, because that document, it was obvious to me, should not have been there. This was the minutes of conversation, of meeting between, at the time, this was 1963, Prime Minister Eshkol and a number of aides, including Minister of Agriculture Dayan, who was former Chief of Staff, the Chief of Staff at the time, Shimon Peres and a few others, with very specific reference to Dimona and to the fact that the Israelis were hiding certain things from the American inspectors. And at one point, Eshkol, the Prime Minister, was saying, well, maybe we're not the only people with this kind of trickery. What happened if the American inspectors who come to Dimona is going to ask to push this and that and they're going to find us? What are we going to do then? Well, the fact is that for about 7 or 8 years, there were just about annual American visits in Dimona as a result of that pressure between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion. And they never found strong evidence or conclusive evidence for weapons-related activities. So what appears in all those documents was that maybe there are some suspicions, and indeed the Israelis wanted to keep some of those suspicions, but there were no evidence, hardcore evidence, for plutonium processing. Of course, Kennedy in his letter, and as I said, I got the letter, the letter got declassified, was remarkably specific in terms of the conditions under which he wanted American inspectors to go to Dimona, to allow them having instruments, to take samples from the ground, no limitations of time or space. The fact is, in reality, the Israelis did control the ground rules of those visits, and for whatever reasons, no direct evidence was found. So that story was quite intriguing. I found that document at the Israeli State Archive. I know that later on, those people concerned about security sent people to look of all the documents that I was looking, and apparently they took some of those documents out. I got them completely legally, but probably by mistake. I recall another moment that I talked to a man who was very senior Israeli scientist, a man with international prestige, who was the second Director General of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, and he was from the Weizmann Institute. And he was, like many others, was quite ambivalent to what extent, if and to what extent to talk to me. He did talk to me off the record, certain things he wanted me to know off the record, but he wanted somehow, without attributing to him that it will be part of the record that I'm bringing. But I recall that when I parked the car, I called him from outside. He said to me, "You must know that even this conversation that you're calling from outside the Weizmann Institute may be bugged. Be careful about it." So I'm trying to make clear that there was a lot of, it was an effort to recover a unique story about Israeli taboo, but at the same time there was a lot of bodies, especially this little security bubble that is in charge of the security of the project, that were a little bit at unease. One time in '95, well, I'll say a word before that, I made various efforts to reach some kind of compromise with Israeli censor, that he would look, and I thought that it was, the way it was written, he should approve most of it, and I knew the ground rules. he felt very uncomfortable. And indeed, it was not even he, the censor, but rather another establishment, the little security establishment that is tied with that nuclear project, that top secret project. And they put some blocks. And at that point, I had to hire a lawyer, and it's a small country, so my lawyer later on became Prime Minister Barak, the person who negotiated with him, Gilad Sher, the Y agreement, the new Y agreement. It's just amazing how it's a small world. In any case, Gilad Sher, my lawyer, made all kinds of exchange of letters to try to reach some kind of compromise. And the censor for a long time telling him for 9 months, it will be okay, just be patient, most of it will be approved, it will be okay. And he was saying that again and again for weeks. At the end, for the first time in Israel history, the entire manuscript, which is a very early prototype of what came out as this book, but it was about 1/8 of what is now this book, for the first time in Israel history was banned from publication. And I'm academic. I am not a former employee of that project. I never been privileged to secrets in this area. And indeed, I did not get any documents in any illegal way. I did talk to people. Some were comfortable to talk to me, some said no, and of course I honor their request. But in any case, it was quite unique that an historical academic piece of writing that was submitted to censor for the first time in Israel history, it was banned. Well, at that point, we felt that we didn't have any other recourse. As a matter of last resort, almost like talking about a bomb, we must go to the Supreme Court. And we did go to the Supreme Court. Within a day, the judge in duty did recognize that there is a case, and he gave the states 45 days to provide full justification why this manuscript, the prototype of the book, cannot be published. This was at the time of the Prime Minister Rabin, who was very much aware of the whole case. In fact, the petition was against two individuals, Prime Minister Rabin, Minister of Defense, and the chief censor, Brigadier General Shani. And they got 40 days from the judge. It took them almost 120 days, number of delays, until there was a full court meeting discussion about it. Well, since national security was involved, Gilad Sher, my lawyer, and myself were outside the court for much of the session because the material that the state was submitting to the court to point out why it's so secret and why that manuscript should be banned could not even shown to us, only in a summary and only with all kinds of deletions. It was also interesting that judges in Israel, like many other judges, who usually very much impressed by national security arguments, in this case, they did not make a ruling on the spot, and they begged both sides, that is to say the state and ourselves, myself and my lawyers, to reach a compromise. We did try to reach a compromise. Actually, I rewrote that prototype the second time in a very different way than it was before. I resubmitted it. Came back to me after about 50 days, and with the same answer, no. And at the same time, there was a table of comparison between the early manuscript and the second manuscript, and the point was it was not different enough. Sorry. At that time, my financial, and I must say that the foundation that supported the project, W.L. Jones, supported also my small legal defense, and they were very generous in giving me a small grant for that. But at that point, money was about to be gone, and I couldn't make these long-distance flights and telephones just to fight for that kind of battle. So very reluctantly, with the advice of my lawyer, we decided to drop the case. The state asked the court, please at least charge them with compensation for the whole time of the whole thing, because they put apparently a lot of time into that case. Well, to this very day, I heard nothing from the court. Not formal approval of my request to drop the case, and of course not any request that I will pay for the compensation or for the money about their expenses. In any case, I came back a few months later on to Israel. I arranged a meeting on this, not historical, but on the subject of non-proliferation and nuclear weapons and so forth. And something quite unusual happened to me in the airport. As I came, I put my passport, and the clerk, the woman at the guard of the police at the airport, she was looking at the passport and saying, "I'm sorry, but would you wait for a moment?" Very high-ranking police officer. The irony was that police officer, a few months later, he was reconstructing with Yigal Amir the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. It was a high police ranking officer who was waiting for me, a little bit embarrassed, to ask me, what will happen with that manuscript? What are you going to do with it? He did not arrest me, and he was very gentle. He told me, actually, we study you in a command course that I had with the army. So I know your material, and I feel a little bit embarrassed to wait for you at the airport on this Shabbat. But the point is that it was a very, very long story. And my message was that manuscript, what we work and what was the whole legal battle, that would not see the light of the day. However, I'm continuing with my work. I know much more, and wait for the book. Well, this was not over. About a year and a half ago, a few months before the hardcover was about to come out, somebody from the Israeli embassy called me, the police liaison officer, and he wanted to meet me. I told him, well, come to my office, I'll be happy to meet you. With a colleague of mine, Ehud Sprintzak, I wanted to have somebody witness about that, and the question was, what will happen with the book, and are you going to submit it to censor? My answer was, no, I'm not. It's too late, anyway. And I don't believe that there is anything in that book, and in fact I wrote it, that is really harming Israeli national security. It does tell a lot of history. Well, so that's the final stage. The book did come out about a year ago, a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, the paperback edition came out. I do believe, to the best of my consciousness, I think I know something about it, and indeed, many people confirm that in their judgment of the book, that in terms of national security secrets, the book does not reveal anything which today is harmful to the State of Israel. And I wouldn't do that. Nevertheless, the book is an effort, and I'll say a few words about what I tried to do that, and I'll finish. The book is an effort to reconstruct that story of what I call in the book opacity, in Hebrew amimut, or ambiguity, how it came about. And I put the emphasis on 4 layers. Domestic layers, from the time of Ben-Gurion, and how that culture of secrecy evolved, not being able to articulate objectives and specific goals, and at the same time pushing forward with the work itself. At the level of the American-Israeli relations, and I think this was the most important level, and indeed most available documents. I'm not talking right now about people. I was able to interview a lot of people, almost 150 people. But in terms of documents, I was able to look, I think probably over 1 million documents in Israeli and American archives, and on the fabric of the American-Israeli relations around this topic, I was able to find quite a bit. And it's a very intriguing story of from complete denial, secrecy, complete denial, an effort to reach some kind of ambiguity, to reconciliation through 3 pairs of American and Israeli leaders. Confrontation was between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion. An effort to deal and to learn to build ambiguity was between President Johnson and Prime Minister Eshkol. In many ways, very similar domestic-oriented leaders. And the reconciliation and articulating the rules of the games was between President Nixon and Prime Minister Golda Meir. And in many ways, the rules of the games that were found and were articulated around 1970 in the first major visit of Golda Meir in the United States do hold and do persist to this very day. Ironically, in Israel, perhaps overzealous effort to try to comply to these understandings, to these ground rules, even I myself, as an author, became to some extent a victim. But that may be, and some people suggest maybe a story for another book. So I'll finish with that and I'll be very happy to respond to questions. Yeah.
Question 1. Does Israel have the atomic bomb? Question 2.
Mm-hmm.
Did they get it before the Yom Kippur or after? Around that time. When was the time?
Okay.
You don't have to answer the first question. Just go to the second.
I think it's very obvious from my book that Israel did have or did complete the development stage of the nuclear weapons project sometimes around 1966. This was also the time that Dimona was already beginning to produce fission material. One of the revelations of the book, and after finishing the book, I got even more inside information about that, and I'll say it very briefly, is that by the eve of the Sixth Day War, that is to say 1967, not 1973, 1967, Israel did have 2 nuclear devices. And obviously, as is the case with developers, with scientists, who play a very limited role at time of war, but look for any possibility to play some kind of role before the war, and to show and to feel that what they did for so many years, by the way, we're talking about from 1958 to 1966, so it took about 8 years until Israel reached the full capacity. I didn't say bomb, I said full capacity. In 67, they happened to have 2 devices. They were not bombs, they were devices. It means they were not delivered from a plane. It means that that they were bulky and not very much like what the U.S. had in Almagadro, the Day of Trinity. That is, but the U.S. had its own nuclear test in July 1945, as opposed to the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, obviously, my book, by the way, for very specific reasons, thematic as well as in terms of access to material, ends in 1970. When I said thematic, the opacity, Amimut in Hebrew, was essentially completed by that time, by this agreement, by these understandings. Most of it was unwritten. Very little of it was written in a very classified way, which I did not reach, between Kissinger, National Security Advisor, and Yitzhak Rabin, the ambassador in Washington. So those understandings were reached about 1970, and this was for me a nice way to end the book, because it's a history, political history of that opacity, the evolution and the formation of opacity. But it's obvious that if they had a bomb in 67 or device in 1967, they must have something in 1973. So
the Egyptian, when they moved in to Sinai and they stopped, was that a consideration?
That's an open question. In fact, if I'm thinking about doing another book, that will be, and I am, that would be a very intriguing question. We don't have, I think, conclusive answer to that. There is no question that it was, by 1973, well known in the sense that even though it was not acknowledged, it was well recognized that Israel doesn't have that capability. How much? Issue of doctrines, under what circumstance might be used, this was not said. I think a pattern that appears on the Arab side was that as long as you don't have to look into this issue, to face the bomb, you try to look the other way as well. Indeed, in my view, the Arabs were quite complacent in the making, in the evolution of opacity. So to what extent it was part of their consideration before 1976, it's not that clear. I'm almost certain that they understood they cannot go all the way. I mean, part of it for military reasons. They didn't expect them to be so successful, to go all the way to the middle of the Sinai, perhaps to the old border. At the same time, I would say that it is likely that some consideration did play. To what extent? Documents, no, we don't have it, and it's open, intriguing question. Yes?
You mentioned in your introduction that one of the reasons you looked into this thing was because if Israel developed the atomic weapon, that you were thinking that maybe the Arabs would too. Can you respond to this other aspect of the question? Besides Iraq that tried to develop atomic weapons, has any other Arab country developed, has a nuclear weapons capability right now?
Well, today, Iraq is the one that was very close around 1990, as we all know, and I think that it was very lucky for Israel, the fact that Iraq made such a major miscalculation by invading the Kuwait, and the rest is known, the rest is history. Iran is on its way. It's difficult to say how close it's to the bomb. I think that's at least 5 to 10 years. Israel did it, by the way, in a short time, even though it was not, it was a project that was always taken very seriously. And at certain times by Ben-Gurion, and he resigned in 1963, it was seen something like a certain element of sacredness that, that in terms of devoting resources and money, it was extremely important to him. He did fundraising, by the way, outside the normal channels, which is interesting, and it's not so unusual because the U.S. in its own early nuclear history did the same. I mean, certain things did not come to Congress. So 8 years is rather good time to have the bomb in a project which was not a crash program. It was not, I don't think the Israeli project should be called a crash program. It is also intriguing, response to your questions, that in 1962, Israel did discover about the work of German scientists in Egypt. And in looking back, this is an amazing case in which an episode that on the one hand, I mean, you can look at it from a number of angles, Israel was very late in terms of intelligence to find it. The beginning was in 1959, 1960, and the Israelis got really solid evidence only in 62 after the Egyptians made some tests of prototypes. It caused panic in Israel. People told me about sessions and meetings late night with Paris and others, how to respond to that. This actually initiated the Israeli movement to purchase a ballistic missile from France. Later on was produced in Israel itself, the Jericho. In retrospect, we know that what Egypt did was very little success, problems with the guiding systems, problems with the fuel and other things. But it was that particular event had enormous impact on the entire arms race in the Middle East. I mean, something that first was intelligence blunder, Israel did not know about it. Then there was overestimation that led to major internal domestic fights within Israel, including the removal, the resignation of the man in charge of the Israeli security service at the time, Israel El, and major fight between Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir that led to his Ben-Gurion resignation and lost power. It had enormous domestic ramification. And I think also it has impact on the entire arms race in the Middle East in terms of the missiles and so forth.
So your answer is what? That the Arabs do not have a...
Today we are lucky enough that no Arab country is close to the bomb right now. Iran is a serious.
And Pakistan.
Pakistan is a Muslim country, but it's not an Arab country.
What about their frequently in the news, it's like conversations between Saudi Arabia and visits to the Pakistani nuclear sites and make conjectures about what they're planning to do? Is there any truth in that?
You know, Saudi Arabia does not have any nuclear infrastructure of any real substance. I don't think it's at the present time in a very serious way. Yes.
Yeah, several questions. I was wondering, A, is there any kind of anti-nuke sentiment among the Israeli population, and does it have any base? Is there any ramifications or feelings you have in terms of what was not signed in Congress, the nuclear test ban treaty? And the third thing is, you know, if you look at the history of Israel, there was a lot of help by Americans, especially American Jews, from the military, everything. Was there any, I mean, I haven't read your book yet, evidence in terms of American scientists helping clandestinely or not so clandestinely, or moving to Israel and being part of that? Or was this all Israeli generated? Or European scientists, for that matter? I mean, I guess we don't have paperclip. I don't think we'd have German scientists moving to Israel.
Okay,
Unless they went before the war.
One about the anti-nuclear sentiment. I think part of the incredible ambivalence that we have in Israel is the fact that almost there is no discussion of the nuclear issue, so there is no really openly pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. It's an issue that even the left, that in many other places is quite active on the anti-nuclear consciousness, on this very issue feel quite inhibited. So except tiny little things that had to do with the Vanun and few supports that he has, very few, and very isolated, there is essentially almost complete respect. It goes to all levels, from the high political level to the level of body politics and the level of the intellectuals, not to talk much on the nuclear issue. So, however,
Because Israel needs the bomb to be what's the
that's right. The rationale is that Israel, in order to go to peace, the left feel, in order to make territorial concessions, we need to have the bomb. Of course, there is no any discussion about what is enough, how much is enough. At one point, we should say there is a ceiling, or we should put a ceiling. There is no any discussion about doctrine. There are many issues that in virtually any country, including India, for example, there is discussion, but in Israel, and it is not from somebody just by the censorship. It goes very much as something that ties leaders with their own population, with their own constituency, feeling that it is not right to talk about. My own view is, and I share some of that element up to a point, I think that certain aspects should be talked about. A mature country like Israel today, 50 years old, can talk about certain things. So I believe strongly that much of it, not all of it, but some of it can be discussed in the open without compromising national security. But the impact and the strength and the depth of that taboo is still very powerful. I do hope that my book will come out in Hebrew. It will come out next year. It's being in translation as we're talking. It was bought by a very good Israeli publisher, by Shoken. So I hope it will help to ease and to somewhat lose the debate on this issue. Your second question was about the CTBT. Very briefly, I very much regret that it did not pass the Congress, and I think that the U.S. right now, in its effort to try to talk to Israel about nuclear issue, will have much more difficulties. No question about it, and it's unfortunate. The third element was about...
Just in terms of, were there scientists who went there before the war?
Oh, that's right.
The war, American,
That's
you know,
right.
for their
I found...
scientists believe-
Yes. I found enormous amount of rumors to that effect. I decided in this book that if I don't really have strong evidence, essentially either in writing, from archival evidence, or from very, very credible sources, I'm not going to talk about things which are just rumors. So in the book, I talk very little about it. You know, as we know about the Russians, I mean, the Russian first bomb was essentially is a result of espionage. But at the same time, Russian scientists, and there is a big debate in Russia itself, to what is the trade-off between the Russian scientists and what the KGB or the NKVD did for them. And of course, the scientists say that, you know, we essentially need to try to rely on ourselves. And even if they use some element design, we have to test and we have to calculate on ourselves. I believe that much of the credit for the Israeli work is to Israeli scientists. Of course, you know, Israel, like any other state outside the U.S., did not discover the existence of nuclear weapons. They all started with the fact that there are nuclear weapons around, and it's feasible, it's possible, just a question of how to do it, which is much easier than the question that the Manhattan Project had, whether it's feasible, how to do it. But I believe that even though Israeli scientists may have talked to many others and may have sought for some kind of advice, much of the work, I think, was by Israeli scientists. Yes?
There's a rumor that Libya may be developing the bomb. Do you know anything about that?
Well, the rumors are for a long, long time, and apparently Gaddafi at a certain time tried to purchase the bomb by money. I don't believe that Libya, in terms of its own infrastructure, scientific, technological infrastructure, is capable to produce the bomb. And we're lucky, if I'm right. Yes?
The reactor in Dimona is reaching the end of its useful life. Do you know what Israel plans to do to replace it? And also, in the absence of testing, how does Israel validate the reliability of its nuclear weapons? Do you know?
Well, these two questions are much beyond the scope of the book. I haven't been Dimona.
It's a shirt fact.
The director of Dimona would not talk to me. So the question about how much Dimona is close to the end of its life is highly speculative. I believe that if you have good engineers, you can upgrade a lot of elements, and especially if you need it, at least politically, so you can maintain the reactors to work even after 40 or 50 years. How much of what you have today is what the French gave them in 1957 to 1962? That's a different question. So I don't worry that much about it in terms of the lifetime of Dimona. The other question was in terms of testing. And again, it's beyond the scope of the book. There are many, many rumors about what happened in 1979 in the South Atlantic. I happened to run into, the other day, into Admiral Turner, who happened to be the head of the CIA in 1979. And we just chatted. I mean, he's also involved right now. He's a fellow at the University of Maryland, and I happen to have a little office there too. And this was the first time I met him, so we 20 minutes just chatted and asked him about that. He gave a longer answer, but I can tell you that he, as director of the CIA at the time, believed that there was a test. And he did not believe that whatever the Ruina Commission, which was the commission that the White House Science Office made, including all kind of fancy scientists like Sidney Drell and Panofsky and many others, does not take seriously their conclusion. Their conclusion, by the way, was not that there was no test, but we don't have enough and sufficient evidence to conclude conclusively that there was test. Therefore, it might be what they call a zoo event, any other kind of atmospheric or any other event. Yes?
Yeah, two questions. Did you come across any documentation regarding the relationship between South African nuclear scientists and the Israeli nuclear scientists? A little bit of follow-up on that question. And secondly, where's the nuclear waste deposit? Is it left on at Dimona, or is there another geological repository?
Well, again, two interesting questions which are beyond my book. I can say that there was connection and cooperation between Israel and South Africa during the dark time of South Africa, perhaps unfortunately. I do believe that cooperation did not move and did not cover the area of nuclear weapons design. I'm almost certain about that. Why do I say that? For both technical and political reasons. I believe and I know that Israel is extremely cautious and careful in this area. In other words, what I do believe is that there was a certain exchange in materials, nuclear materials, between Israel and South Africa. Essentially, it was exchange of a few grams of tritium, which apparently the Israelis persuaded the South African in the late 70s that maybe they would need it in the future for more advanced nuclear weapons, for some natural uranium that South Africa had quite a lot of that. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, and we do know actually, that there was some cooperation in the area of funding the Israeli missile project, the Jericho 2, the expanded Israeli missile in terms of money. And apparently the South African replaced the Iranians in that project. I'm almost certain, for many reasons, which I cannot, it has to do with people I know and sources that I know, and that there was no cooperation on nuclear weapons design between Israelis and South Africa. We do know that South African developed what we call a gun type of uranium bomb. For all what we know, this is not the kind of design the Israelis were doing, either early on or later on. So there was cooperation, but to the best of my understanding, and again, maybe I don't know, it was not in the area of nuclear weapons design for many reasons, including political and moral reasons.
Geological repository, do you know if it's left,
Oh,
left on site?
that's a very disturbing question that I don't know much about it. From all we know, apparently Israel does cover it in so-called temporary sites at Dimona itself of highly radioactive material. Probably it's something very much like what the U.S. did in Hanford, Washington State. And I think there is a lot of reason to worry about that because of the secrecy and essentially the regulation of the Israeli Environmental Ministry do go until the fence of the Dimona facility, not behind it. And it is unfortunate that there is no There is nobody to guard the guardians. Yes.
I have a few questions also.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Vanunu. I know he comes after your book ends, but would you be willing to tell us whether, for example, what he went public with was basically accurate at the time, and what your feelings are about the way in which he was brought back to Israel and the sentence and so on?
Yes.
That's A.
Yeah.
The next is about whether with the fruits of your investigation, you know whether there was ever an incident in which the Israeli defense and political establishment came close to moving from the device to a weapon which could be deployed. Was there ever a time when that was a serious possibility? And the third is a follow-up on Dimona. I've read things that indicate there's a lot of concern locally about the possibility of leakage into the underground water supply in that area, but because it's not open, people feel effects without being able to get to the source, which is exactly what happened in Hanford, which you mentioned.
I'll start with Vanunu. You know, when Aretz, the Israeli paper, had a big story about myself in their magazine, they took a line, which indeed I did say to their reporter, which was, "I'm not a Vanunu." And it was very important for me, for many reasons, to make full distance between what he did and where I am and what I have been doing. I'm obviously an academic who never had access to classified material, who is doing history and political science, and did what I did completely legitimately. Vanunu did betray Israel. There is no question about it. So I do have, in that respect, that's the way I feel like most Israelis, that he is a traitor. At the same time, and unlike many Israelis, I think that his case has a lot of uncomfortable ambiguities. One of them has to do with the fact that Vanunu, and I know it for a fact, it's not part of the public record, but I do know it for a fact, Vanunu could have been stopped a number of times during the time that he was like a very loose person in Australia in the early summer of 1986, began to talk about it and began to look and to search for journalists to tell their stories, until the time that he was kidnapped from Italy, first from England was seduced to Italy, and then kidnapped from Italy to Israel. And the Israelis could have stopped him in many ways that the story would not come in the Sunday Times. Shimon Peres was the prime minister. And to the best of my understanding, and maybe I'm making small factual gap, because I don't have all the information, but to the best of my understanding, to the best of my reconstruction of what happened, the Israelis decided, Shimon Peres decided, let him say what we cannot say in order to enhance deterrence. In other words, he can say something that we cannot say it, we are inhibited, and then punish him. I think there is something at least uncomfortable about when top politicians, about the morality of that kind of decision, to punish somebody who is, I think of Vanunu as somebody who is like almost like an elephant who began to roam in a China store, have no sense of the sensitivity. He believed that he's going to tell the world something as if the world doesn't know about it. In fact, the whole fabric of opacity is that indeed the world does know about it. And there is a deliberate effort to look the other way around that. But Vanunu, also in my view, is almost an inevitable product of the regime of opacity, when you don't even explain to employees the purpose and the importance and the significance of what they're doing, and something about the complexity of why Israel is handling its affairs in this area the way it is. My own view is that if Israel is asking for compassion, not for justice, but for compassion for Jonathan Pollard, who also betrayed his country, the United States, I think there is the same room to ask that Israel would show a gesture of goodwill in terms of Vanunu, to show compassion, even though he does not deserve justice. Vanunu is now already 13 years in jail. He got 18 years. Essentially, almost every criminal, rapist, murderer, thieves, and so, get 2/3 and then they got off. They get the last third is they get free. In the case of Vanunu, he is going to be in jail for a very, very long time to complete the term of his prison. I would like that under some right circumstances, political circumstances, some compassion will be made to Vanunu. The problem with Vanunu is that I mentioned that I see him as somebody who is like an elephant who is running in China store. That's right. Even to the present day, the two of them are so stubborn that they want to talk about it. I mean, if you want to cut a deal with them, say at least don't talk about it for 5 or 10 years and be quiet. Vanunu refused, just as Paul refused. So it makes even the context on human, because I think there is humanitarian grounds to try to release him in the right political moment. But he doesn't help for that. So it's a very complex with a lot of gray area. You had other questions.
Was there ever a time when they came close to making good on the implicit threat of the use of the...
Well, in 1973, I think what has been established is how much Israel was indeed a very responsible member of the nuclear club, in the sense that even situation that for some people, Moshe Dayan was at panic at the very early phase of the war. And of course, some preparations were made, but the fact is Israel was not close to make a threat, let alone to use nuclear weapons. So Israel did establish its credential as a responsible nuclear player. And 1973 was the right moment. At the same time, I believe that the shadowy presence of nuclear weapons in 1973 was important for Sadat mission to Israel in 1977, and perhaps even to eliminate the notion of big war, as we had in 67-73, from the Arab-Israeli conflict. Just as perhaps the presence of the nuclear weapons was important not to have World War III between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Yes?
A question just to follow up on what you said, because you asked about going from devices to actually weaponization, and I think you might be giving a wrong impression if you think the Israelis have not weaponized in some way. After all, in the early history of our nuclear weapons, as has been underlined by a recent document that was declassified, the cores were, the pits, the fissionable pits were kept separate from the surrounding chemical explosive, but those were weapons ready to be delivered once you inserted the pit. So I would take the opposite view, namely that Israel very likely has nuclear artillery shells. Well, I mean, I don't know for facts. I'm just being extreme about that.
I can say one thing that actually, by the way, the book has a website that a lot of the primary documents, both in Hebrew and in English, can be found in that website. The website is being mentioned in the last page of the cover. Some of the very intriguing documents, and that's the question that Milton just raised, came in the dialogue, very intriguing dialogue, almost a Talmudic dialogue, between Paul Warneke in 1968, at the time the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Ambassador Yitzhak Rabin, in the context of the first Phantom Deal, 1968, October, November. And in fact, I have virtually most of the minutes declassified are the real documents, this discussion. And one of the main questions that came in those documents, in that discussion between Rabin and Warneke, and the U.S. wanted Israel to sign certain things, certain limitations, certain clarifications about what Israel has or does not have. And it came to the questions of what is a weapon? And Rabin made a point that as long as you have a weapon system which has not been tested, this is not, from his perspective, as a general, as a chief of staff, this is not a weapon system. Paul Warneke said, well, if you have all the elements in one room and some elements in the other room, and you just need to assemble it together, half an hour, 2 hours, whatever, that is for him a weapon system. So obviously there was part of the issue of opacity is the fact that there is this area of grayness about the very definition of what is nuclear weapons. Milton said, I mean, if you don't have if the pit's in somewhere else and the rest of the peripheral aspect of nuclear weapons is in another place, is it a nuclear weapon? It's certainly unassembled. It's unassembled by bunch of explosives and electronics and all kinds of items is a weapon or not a weapon, especially when it was not tested. So there is this complexity of definition is also a technical conceptual aspect of this opacity. And it came in a very intriguing way in this exchange, almost Talmudic exchange, or Socratic exchange, between Paul Warneke and Yitzhak Rabin in 1968. Yes?
I'm just wondering, would you describe that the doctrine is opacity, but how does, not knowing so much about this subject, I'm just curious, if you're growing up in Israel and you're attending school, is that information about, is it disseminated? Do people learn about it? If they do, how do they learn about it? And what are your interpretations of?
Good. It's interesting that you may heard that there is a new book, which is a new curriculum for high school about Israeli history that just came out recently by actually a colleague of mine from Tel Aviv University, Eyal Naveh. And the book brings many, but not all, of the claims that were made in the last decade by the so-called Israeli historians, including Benny Morris and others. In review to that, or in a little story about that book, and the book made some noise in Israel because some people were annoyed by that. Others said Naveh did not go enough. And there is a new government in Israel right now, and the new Ministry of Education run by Yossi Sarid, which is much more on the left. Tom Segev, who is the author of the book, The Seventh Million, important book about the impact of the Holocaust on Israeli culture, a acquaintance of mine, in his comment in Haaretz, he said, it's too bad that this book by Naveh does not cover some of the nuclear stuff. Here is something which has so profound, actually you referred to my own book, Tom Segev said, Avner Cohen just came out with a book and he's not the only one. There is more and more talk about this issue. How come that issue is not being even mentioned in this new curriculum of Israeli history? So you're right, the issue is still uncomfortable. And again, this is not simply because of censorship. There is something much more profound about it. The ambivalence about nuclear weapons is much more profound than to be explained by a matter of censorship. And it will take a while until it will incorporate into the main Israeli discourse. I hope very much that my book will be one of the vehicles that will help to do that. And in doing so, would make Israel more mature, more accountable, in a way more democratic. But it's a long struggle. Yes?
The submarine that was lost, it was a nuclear one, was it? The submarine that never disappeared. The Israeli submarine? Yeah. Someone help me.
The car that was lost. To the best of my understanding, there were all kind of stories that came after that. Yeah, but to the best of my understanding, there was no nuclear component to it. Yes? Maybe the last one?
The U.S. and Israel are strengthening their strategic relationship, and high-level Israeli officials have been to the Pentagon recently. I wonder, how candid do you think they are about Israel's policy, nuclear policy now? Do you have any insight?
That's a real issue, and to the best of my understanding, based on various rumors, gossip, whatever, is that this issue is indeed highly problematic to this very day. What was on the agenda in the last year or so, including the last year of Netanyahu in office, was a series of exchanges between, this did not come to the media, but it was there. Actually, it was recently cited, including by Schiff and Aluf Benny Haaretz, even though it was not at the time in the media. A series of exchanges between President Clinton and Israel on the question of the fissile material cutoff, which is one of the items on the arms control agenda of this country, and indeed the world. This is an item it's on the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. And there was a need, in order to have a mandate committee that begin to work on this treaty, like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There is an effort to try to articulate, to write a treaty on fissile material cutoff. And there are many, many items, many elements within that concept which is still unclear, and there is a lot of debate. Nevertheless, in order to have a mandate for a committee in that body, in Geneva, the Conference on Disarmament, to begin to draft and to begin discussions, you need a consensus. Israel is a member of that body. And you need a consensus. And President Clinton, as of late 98, pressed Netanyahu very strongly on this issue. And it came to the point that Netanyahu had to say yes, issuing a statement that Israel would not be an obstacle for that kind of consensus. At the same time, Israel reserving the right not to sign, let alone to ratify, that kind of treaty whenever it will come out, which is a matter of years. The U.S. did try, apparently, to discuss with Israel and to understand the Israelis' reasons for the sensitivity on this issue, and to try to work with Israel a draft or approach to the treaty that would satisfy all or most of Israeli concerns. One of them, for example, is that the treaty would cover just future activities, no more production without compromising the past. That is to say, for example, how much plutonium or highly enriched uranium was produced in Dimona. Apparently, Israel even refused to explain to the U.S. in private, intimate meetings of various classified committees, which do meet on biannual basis most of the time, the reasons why it has this objection. In the letter of Netanyahu, after he gave his agreement for the consensus, was that Israel is not going to agree with that later on, and he even compared it to something like, the language was something like this very survival of Israel is involved with this issue. So to the best of my understanding, again, I think there is something unhealthy about it. The fact that these two close allies cannot discuss this issue, even in the intimacy of the most classified forums. It's unhealthy, and I hope it will change. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well,
I hope you know. These are still in the air. They have to be corrected. No. You want me to do it with the signing?
If you don't mind, sure. Right here would be great.
Yeah, were you able to just...
No,
My question was, I think we're willing to have the United States and Israel talk about it, in a very classified sense. But I assume you don't want Israel
questions of official code. I think you need a very specific context. That's the reason why I'm not talking about it.